Moving to a new neighborhood should have been a fresh start for young Scott Davis. But on his first day at his new school, he quickly learned that being different made him a target. What happened next would change not just his life, but the entire school forever. Scott Davis was 14 years old and had always been the kind of boy who thrived on routine. Growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, his days were predictable yet comforting. He loved exploring the mysteries of science, poring over books about space and great inventors. His world was small but familiar, surrounded by friendly neighbors, a school where everyone knew his name, and weekend visits to the local library with his parents. Everything changed when his father's job required the family to move. The announcement came over dinner one evening. "We're relocating to the city," Mr. Davis said, his tone excited but firm. Scott's heart sank. The city meant leaving behind his friends, his school, and everything he had ever known. The weeks leading up to the move were a blur of packing boxes and tearful goodbyes. The family's new neighborhood was a stark contrast to the quiet suburbs Scott had left behind. The streets buzzed with activity, cars honked incessantly, and the buildings seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Their new house was smaller, tucked into a busy block where the sounds of neighbors and conversations and city life filtered through the thin walls. Scott's room, once his sanctuary, now felt unfamiliar and cramped. He spent hours arranging his books and trying to recreate a sense of normalcy, but nothing felt right. His parents were optimistic about the move. Mr. Davis was settling into his new managerial role at work, often leaving early and returning late. Mrs. Davis, juggling freelance projects, tried her best to keep the household running smoothly. They reassured Scott that the city would offer opportunities he couldn't find in their old town. "You'll make new friends in no time," his mother said, but Scott wasn't so sure. The biggest change was Lincoln High, his new school. Unlike his old school, where he had been surrounded by familiar faces, Lincoln High was a large, predominantly black school with a vibrant but overwhelming energy. On his first day, Scott felt like he was stepping into another world. As he walked through the double doors, the noise of students talking, laughing, and greeting each other filled the air. Groups of friends gathered in the hallways, exchanging handshakes and high fives. Scott's pale face and uncertain demeanor stood out in the bustling crowd. His homeroom teacher, Mrs. Anderson, introduced him briefly before the class. "Class, this is Scott Davis. He's new here, so let's all make him feel welcome." A few students nodded politely, but most barely looked up from their desks. Scott shuffled to an empty seat near the back, acutely aware of the whispers and glances directed his way. Lunch was even harder. Scott carried his tray to the farthest corner of the cafeteria and sat alone, pretending to read a book. The noise around him was deafening, students shouting across tables, laughing and sharing jokes. Scott kept his head down, hoping to go unnoticed, but he could feel the stares. It didn't take long for Marcus and his friends to spot him. Marcus was the kind of person who commanded attention without trying. Tall and confident, he moved through the cafeteria like he owned it. Behind him were his three closest friends, each playing their role in the group. They walked past Scott's table once, then again, before Marcus stopped and leaned over. "Hey, new kid," Marcus said, his tone casual but laced with mockery. "What's your name again? Oh wait, let me guess. Whitey, right?" His friends erupted into laughter. Scott's face burned, but he kept his eyes fixed on his book, pretending not to hear. "Too good to talk to us?" Another boy chimed in, tossing a crumpled napkin onto Scott's tray. Scott's heart pounded in his chest, but he stayed silent, hoping they would lose interest. They didn't. The group lingered, throwing more taunts and laughing loudly before finally walking away. The rest of the day was no better. In every class, Scott felt like an outsider. Students whispered as he walked past, and even the teachers seemed unsure how to connect with him. By the time he got home, Scott was emotionally drained. He trudged up to his room without saying much to his parents, who were too busy to notice how quiet he had become. Over the next few days, the bullying escalated. It wasn't just Marcus and his group. Even students who didn't know him joined in the laughter and whispers. In the hallways, someone would accidentally bump into him, causing him to drop his books. In the cafeteria, his tray would be nudged just enough to spill his drink. Scott endured it all in silence, too scared and ashamed to tell his parents. At home, Mr. Davis began to notice that Scott wasn't himself. He seemed quieter, more withdrawn, and spent hours alone in his room. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Mr. Davis tried to probe gently. "How's school, son? Making any new friends?" Scott hesitated, then nodded quickly. "It's fine," he said, avoiding his father's gaze. But Mr. Davis wasn't convinced. Something was clearly wrong, but he didn't know how to reach his son. Meanwhile, Mrs. Anderson had started noticing Scott's withdrawn behavior in class. He rarely participated, kept his head down, and seemed to shrink whenever Marcus or his friends were nearby. She made a mental note to keep an eye on him, sensing that something wasn't right. And then there was Jamie, a quiet student who often observed the dynamics of the school without getting involved. He noticed how Scott was treated, but hesitated to intervene. Jamie wasn't sure if it was fear or indifference that kept him silent, but the sight of Scott's hunched shoulders and downcast eyes was beginning to gnaw at his conscience. The days stretched on, each one more challenging than the last for Scott. The move, the new school, and the relentless bullying weighed heavily on him. Yet, beneath the surface, seeds of change were being planted. Seeds that would eventually grow into something far greater than anyone at Lincoln High could have imagined. Marcus and his group escalated their bullying. It wasn't just words anymore. One day, as Scott walked down the hallway, one of the boys stuck out his foot, sending Scott sprawling onto the floor. His books and papers scattered everywhere, drawing laughter from the surrounding students. Scott scrambled to pick them up, his face red with humiliation. Another day, he found his locker defaced with a racial slur. The sight of it made his stomach churn, but he didn't say anything. Confrontation seemed impossible, and telling someone felt equally hopeless. The worst came after school one afternoon. Marcus and his group cornered Scott near the back gate where fewer students were around. Marcus shoved him against the wall, his face inches away from Scott's. "You think you're better than us, don't you, white boy?" Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Scott shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, I don't." But the words only seemed to fuel Marcus's anger. Another boy pushed Scott from behind, making him stumble. Scott walked home that day with bruises on his arms and tears stinging his eyes. He said nothing to his parents, retreating to his room and staring out the window, wondering how much longer he could endure. The weeks dragged on, and the bullying became more calculated. Marcus and his friends seemed to take pleasure in waiting for the moments when Scott was most vulnerable. During a chemistry class, Scott was paired with another student to complete a lab assignment. Marcus, seated at a nearby table, whispered loud enough for the room to hear, "Better watch out. White boy might try to steal your answers." The room erupted in muffled laughter, and Scott's partner looked at him uncomfortably. Scott's self-esteem continued to erode, and he began dreading every day at Lincoln High. Even the simple act of walking to his classes felt like navigating a minefield. There were moments he considered skipping school altogether, but he couldn't bring himself to explain it to his parents. Despite their good intentions, he doubted they'd understand. Marcus wasn't always the boy who sneered at others and hid his insecurities behind cruel jokes. His upbringing had shaped him in ways he didn't fully understand. Growing up in a small apartment on the edge of the city, Marcus had heard the bitterness in his father's voice almost daily. Marcus's father, a factory worker for most of his life, had lost his job during an economic downturn. He often blamed his struggles on a system he believed favored others. "They'll take the jobs right out of your hands," his father would say at the dinner table, his voice heavy with frustration, "and leave you with nothing." Those words became the soundtrack of Marcus's childhood, seeping into his view of the world. At school, Marcus felt a different kind of pressure. He wasn't the biggest or the smartest, but he had learned early on that confidence, even if it was feigned, could command respect. His friends looked up to him, and he thrived on the attention. But behind the bravado was a boy who feared being seen as weak or insignificant. When Scott arrived at Lincoln High, Marcus saw an opportunity. Scott's quiet demeanor and obvious discomfort made him an easy target. By asserting dominance over Scott, Marcus could solidify his status among his peers and mask his own insecurities. Deep down, though, Marcus wasn't immune to guilt. There were nights when he'd lie awake, replaying the day's events. He'd hear his father's voice in his head justifying his actions, but a small part of him questioned whether it was right to tear someone else down just to feel bigger. Still, the fear of losing his place among his friends kept him locked in a cycle of cruelty, one he didn't know how to break. Scott sat at the dinner table one evening, staring at his plate. His appetite had long disappeared, but he pushed the food around with his fork to avoid his parents' questions. His father's voice broke the silence. "How's school going, son?" Mr. Davis asked, his tone casual but concerned. Scott hesitated, his heart pounding. He wanted to tell him everything, to let it all spill out, but the words felt heavy. "Dad," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't think I like this school." He kept his gaze fixed on the table, afraid of his father's reaction. Mr. Davis sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You just changed schools, son. Give it a chance. You'll get used to it," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're strong, Scott. This is just part of growing up." Scott nodded, though his father's words did little to comfort him. That night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if things would ever get better. The next day, the bullying took a physical turn again. As Scott walked through the hallway, Marcus and his friends blocked his path. One of them shoved him against a locker, and another snatched his backpack, dumping its contents onto the floor. Laughter echoed through the hall as Scott scrambled to pick up his books. He didn't say a word, his hands shaking as he stuffed his things back into his bag. Later that afternoon, as Scott walked home, Marcus's group followed him, their taunts growing louder. "What's the matter, white boy? Can't handle a little fun?" Marcus sneered. They pushed him to the ground, and Scott felt a sharp sting as his lips split against the pavement. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, but he didn't cry out. He simply got up, clutching his backpack tightly and walking away as fast as he could. When Scott arrived home, he slipped past his parents and went straight to his room. He pulled his hoodie up over his head, hoping to hide the evidence of the encounter. His mother knocked on his door a few minutes later. "Scott, are you okay?" she asked softly. "I'm fine, Mom," he replied, his voice muffled. His mother wasn't convinced. She opened the door gently and stepped inside. "Sweetheart, talk to me. What's going on?" she said, sitting beside him on the bed. Scott hesitated, his eyes fixed on the floor. Finally, he pulled the hood down, revealing the split lip and bruises on his face. His mother's eyes widened in shock, and she instinctively reached out to touch his cheek. "Oh, Scott," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who did this to you?" Tears welled up in Scott's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. "It's nothing. Just some kids at school," he muttered. "Nothing? This is not nothing," his mother said firmly, her tone laced with both anger and worry. "Why didn't you tell us?" Scott shrugged, his voice breaking. "I didn't want to bother you and Dad. You're both so busy, and I thought maybe it would stop if I ignored it." Mrs. Davis pulled her son into a tight hug, her heart breaking for him. "You don't have to go through this alone, Scott. We're here for you," she said softly. "Your dad and I are going to make sure this stops, I promise." Scott leaned into her embrace, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting, if only a little. For the first time, he felt like he might not have to face this battle alone. Days turned into weeks, and Scott's behavior at home became harder to ignore. Mr. Davis had always prided himself on being a perceptive father, but the signs were becoming too glaring to dismiss. Scott's usual curiosity was replaced with a quiet detachment, and the sparkle in his eyes seemed dimmed. He avoided conversations, spent hours locked in his room, and his once frequent laughter was now a distant memory. One morning, as Mr. Davis prepared for work, he decided that enough was enough. He made up his mind to visit Lincoln High during his lunch break, unannounced. There was no specific plan, just a need to see for himself what his son's world looked like. When Mr. Davis arrived at the school, the noisy atmosphere immediately struck him. Students filled the hallways, their chatter and laughter echoing off the walls. The cafeteria was his first stop. Standing by the entrance, he scanned the crowd until his eyes landed on Scott, sitting at the far corner, isolated from the bustling groups of students. His son's posture was hunched, his head low, and his tray of untouched food sat in front of him like a shield. Mr. Davis's stomach tightened as he watched. It wasn't just the solitude. It was the way Scott seemed invisible to everyone, except for one group, Marcus and his friends. They approached with a casual confidence, their voices loud and grating as they closed in on Scott's table. "Hey, Whitey, lost your way again?" Marcus said, his words laced with a mocking edge. The group laughed as one of the boys leaned closer, flicking a piece of bread from Scott's tray onto the floor. Scott didn't respond. He sat still, staring at his tray as if he could will them away by ignoring them. The scene sent a wave of anger through Mr. Davis. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor, drawing the attention of several students. The cafeteria noise dimmed as the tension built. "Enough!" Mr. Davis's voice boomed, cutting through the cafeteria chatter like a knife. Marcus and his group froze, their smirks faltering as they turned to see the source of the interruption. Mr. Davis stood tall, his piercing gaze fixed on them. The room went silent, the weight of his authority palpable. "What gives you the right to treat someone this way?" Mr. Davis demanded, his voice steady but firm. His eyes bore into Marcus, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. The boys exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence quickly evaporating. Scott looked up, his wide eyes meeting his father's. Relief and embarrassment warred within him, but he said nothing. His voice caught in his throat. The silence stretched until Mr. Davis spoke again, his voice sharp with conviction. "This ends now. Every one of you owes my son an apology." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Mr. Davis turned to a nearby staff member. "Take me to the principal's office. I need to speak with them immediately." The staff member, a young cafeteria worker, nodded quickly, gesturing for Mr. Davis to follow her. He placed a protective hand on Scott's shoulder and guided him out of the room. The cafeteria erupted into whispers as father and son left, leaving Marcus and his friends standing awkwardly by the table. When they arrived at Principal Johnson's office, Mr. Davis wasted no time. The stern principal sat behind her large desk, her expression calm but serious as Mr. Davis recounted what he had witnessed. His words were laced with both anger and disappointment, and he made it clear that this was not the first time Scott had endured such treatment. "I trusted this school to provide my son with a safe environment to learn and grow," Mr. Davis said firmly. "What I saw today was unacceptable. No child should have to sit through that kind of humiliation." Principal Johnson nodded, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "Mr. Davis, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Bullying is something we take very seriously here at Lincoln High." "I hope so," Mr. Davis replied, "because if action isn't taken, I'll escalate this matter further. My son deserves better than this." Principal Johnson assured him that she would handle the situation immediately. She called for Marcus and his friends to come to her office, summoning their parents as well. The tension in the room was palpable as the boys entered, their usual swagger replaced by nervous fidgeting. "Explain yourselves," Principal Johnson demanded, her voice stern. The boys stammered through half-hearted excuses, avoiding eye contact with Mr. Davis and Scott, who sat silently beside him. "This is unacceptable behavior," Principal Johnson continued. "Your actions not only hurt Scott, but also reflect poorly on this school. There will be consequences." As she outlined the disciplinary measures, which included suspensions and mandatory counseling sessions, Mr. Davis felt a small sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, he saw a flicker of hope in Scott's eyes. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the school. By the next day, whispers of, "Did you hear what happened with Scott's dad?" filled the hallways. Marcus and his friends, once the dominant figures in the cafeteria, now walked with their heads down, their confidence shattered. Scott still sat alone that day, but something felt different. A few students passed by his table, offering small nods or smiles. Jamie, a quiet classmate who had always watched from the sidelines, even sat down across from him. "Hey," Jamie said awkwardly, unpacking his lunch. "Mind if I join you?" Scott hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure." It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for Scott, it was enough to feel like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The next day, the tension in Principal Johnson's office was palpable. Marcus and his friends sat stiffly in the chairs, their usual bravado replaced by nervous fidgeting. Their parents, summoned to discuss the situation, filled the room with a mix of emotions. Marcus's father, a broad-shouldered man with a booming voice, exuded hostility from the moment he walked in. "Why are we here?" Marcus's father demanded, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Why should my son get punished for standing up for himself?" Mr. Davis, seated calmly beside Scott, met Marcus's father's glare with steady composure. "Standing up for himself?" he repeated, his voice measured. "Humiliating and tormenting another child isn't self-defense, it's bullying." Principal Johnson raised her hand to calm the room. "Let's stay focused," she said firmly. "This meeting is about addressing the behavior and ensuring a safe environment for all students." Marcus, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, avoided his father's gaze. His friends sat silently, their eyes fixed on the floor. Marcus's father, however, wasn't done. "This is ridiculous. You think my boy is the only one to blame here? Maybe your son should toughen up," he said, directing his sharp tone at Mr. Davis. Before Mr. Davis could respond, Principal Johnson stepped in. "Enough," she said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about shifting blame, it's about accountability. The actions taken against Scott were deliberate, harmful, and unacceptable. As principal, I won't tolerate such behavior in my school." The room fell silent as Principal Johnson's words hung in the air. For a moment, Marcus appeared to harden, his jaw clenched, but then the tension broke. Tears welled in his eyes, and his voice cracked as he spoke. "I'm just tired," Marcus said, his hands trembling. "Tired of feeling like we're always second best, like we have to fight for everything." His father's expression shifted from anger to shock. "Marcus, what are you talking about?" he asked, his voice softening slightly. Marcus shook his head, struggling to find the words. "You're always talking about how unfair everything is, how no one gives us a chance. I hear it every day, and when Scott showed up, it felt like he had everything handed to him. I don't know. He trailed off, wiping at his eyes. Mr. Davis watched, his initial anger giving way to a flicker of empathy. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a glimpse into the pain that had fueled Marcus's actions. Principal Johnson allowed a moment of quiet before addressing Marcus gently. "Marcus," she said, her tone softening, "feeling overlooked or struggling doesn't give you the right to hurt others, but recognizing that pain is the first step toward change. This is your opportunity to learn and grow." Marcus nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, he looked directly at Scott. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, "for everything." Scott, surprised by the unexpected apology, managed a small nod in return. The meeting concluded with Principal Johnson laying out the consequences. Marcus and his friends were expelled from Lincoln High, a decision that sparked immediate debate among parents and students. Some argued that the punishment was too harsh, while others praised the school's zero-tolerance stance on bullying and racism. To address the growing tension, Principal Johnson organized a school-wide assembly. The event featured speakers who shared personal stories about the impact of prejudice and the importance of empathy. Students listened intently, many reflecting on their own behavior and biases. For Scott, life slowly began to change. Jamie, the quiet classmate who had previously stayed on the sidelines, approached him during lunch one day. "I should have said something earlier," Jamie admitted. "I'm sorry for not standing up for you." Scott hesitated but then smiled. "It's okay. Thanks for saying something now." The two began sitting together at lunch, and over time, their friendship grew. Scott's confidence returned little by little as he found support in his peers and teachers like Mrs. Anderson, who continued to check in on him regularly. As for Marcus, his expulsion forced him into therapy. Initially resistant, he gradually opened up about his struggles, his father's influence, and the anger he had carried for years. The sessions became a turning point, helping him confront his feelings and start on a path toward healing. Inspired by everything he had been through, Scott poured his thoughts into an essay for an English assignment titled, "What It Means to Be Different." In it, he wrote, "Being different doesn't make you less, it makes you unique. It's how we treat each other that defines who we are. Understanding and kindness are choices we make every day, and those choices can change the world." The essay earned him recognition in a school competition, and Principal Johnson even read an excerpt aloud during the assembly. Scott's words resonated with many, sparking conversations that extended beyond the walls of Lincoln High. Here brings us to the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring you even more powerful narratives. We also want to hear from you. Have you ever faced any form of racism, even as a white person? Share your experiences in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about understanding, empathy, and making the world a better place for everyone. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.